The transport ship, Dominion's hand, hung above Earth like a scar that refused to heal. It was the 47th occupation vessel to arrive in just 7 days. By now, the people below no longer looked up in anger. There wasn't enough anger left. The first ships had been met with protests. The next with defiance. After that came grief. The CaHFY Dominion had quietly removed all three. Not with executions. Not with orbital bombardments. With paperwork. With psychologists. With compliance officers who smiled as they explained why resistance was unhealthy and cooperation would improve everyone's quality of life. That was how the Dominion conquered civilizations. They never called it conquest. They called it administration. For more than 11,000 years, the CaHFY had perfected the art of taking worlds without firing unnecessary shots. They arrived carrying translators instead of battle standards, engineers instead of executioners, doctors instead of interrogators. They repaired failing infrastructure, eliminated disease, increased food production, lowered crime, and restored order with cold mathematical efficiency. Every improvement came with another regulation. Every regulation came with another surrendered freedom. Most civilizations never realized they had lost their independence until it had already become irreversible. The CaHFY considered that proof their system worked. Earth considered it something else. Occupation. Across every continent, people watched the enormous vessel descend through layers of cloud with impossible precision. It cast a shadow large enough to swallow entire cities, drifting silently toward the surface as if it already owned the planet beneath it. Officially, the CaHFY Dominion had come to help humanity. Unofficially, humanity had already decided that some freedoms were worth more than perfect order. The Dominion simply hadn't discovered that yet. But by the time the humans understood what was happening, the CaHFY had already embedded themselves into every critical system on the planet. The power grids answered to Dominion frequencies. The orbital defense platforms had been upgraded generously, the CaHFY said, with Dominion standard targeting locks. The heads of 193 national governments had been invited aboard processing vessels for administrative orientation, and none of them had come back quite the same. The compliance officers called it calibration. The humans called it something else. But on the morning that would become known in every human history book written afterward as the day of first processing, the CaHFY issued a single planetary broadcast in 47 languages, and every word of it was warm, welcoming, kind. It announced that all human children between the ages of 3 and 14 would be collected over the following 30 days for what the Dominion called integration preparation, a standard procedure applied to every newly administered species, designed to ensure that the next generation would grow up as full citizens of the CaHFY Dominion rather than as remnants of a pre-integration culture. The children would be educated, cared for, returned at 16 with complete Dominion citizenship. It said nothing about where they would be taken. It said nothing about contact with parents. It said nothing about what the children would remember when they came back. In a suburb of what used to be called Chicago, a woman named Mara Voss stood at her kitchen window and watched the transport crawler move down her street. It was enormous, 30 meters long, pale gray, utterly silent, moving on repulsor fields that left the pavement unmarked. It stopped at each house. Officers in white administrative uniforms knocked on each door. They carried tablets and spoke in soft voices. They had already processed the compliance data on every household on the block. They knew which families had children aged 3 to 14. They knew which parents had been calibrated and which had not. They did not know that Maravos had spent the previous 11 days doing something that CaHFY had not thought to categorize as a threat. She had been writing letters not to the Dominion, not to any government, not to any resistance movement or underground network, because those had been administratively dissolved within 72 hours of first contact. She had been writing letters to every parent she could reach, 214 of them in her district alone. And the letters contained one thing: a date, a time, a place, and 4 words: bring everything you have. When the knock came at her door, Morales dried her hands on a dish towel, walked to the front of her house, and opened it before the compliance officer could knock a second time. She looked at the officer, tall, silvery, with the flat professional affect of a species that had done this to 1,000 worlds, and she smiled. The officer consulted his tablet. "We are here for the child registered at this address," he said. Voss Ellie, age 7, integration preparation transport departs at 1400 hours. Please have her ready. "I know," said Mara. The officer looked up from his tablet. In 11,000 years of administering species transitions, he had encountered very few words from a parent in this moment that were not either crying or pleading. "I know," she said again, and her voice was the steadiest thing he had ever heard from a human being. "And I want you to tell your commanding officer something for me. Can you do that?" The officer blinked. It was not a question in his processing tree. "Tell him," said Maravos, "that we've been patient, and that patience is not the same thing as acceptance, and that there is a difference between a species that doesn't fight back and a species that is still deciding how." She let Ellie go that morning because she had to, because the CaHFY had made certain she had no choice. But as the crawler moved down the street, and her daughter's face pressed against the gray polymer window, and Mara lifted one hand and held it there long after the vehicle turned the corner, she was already moving. The CaHFY had made one assumption about humans that was by any reasonable galactic standard completely defensible. They assumed that humans, like every other species they had ever administered, would fracture. It was the universal pattern. New administrative subjects experienced grief, then confusion, then the slow dissolution of collective identity as dominion systems replaced local ones. It happened to the Orathi, it happened to the Vel Syndicate, it happened to the silicon-based hive minds of the Calorian Belt, who were considered by most xenociologists to be far more cognitively unified than humanity. Every species, when separated from its young, turned inward, became individual, became manageable. The CaHFY did not have a word for what humans did instead. They would need to invent one. Mara Voss had been a middle school science teacher before the Dominion arrived. She had no military training, no political connections, no resources beyond what existed in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb that the CaHFY's administrative assessment had classified as low resistance probability, Zone 7. She had a car that still ran on combustion fuel because the KE hadn't bothered to upgrade it. She had a basement full of camping equipment her ex-husband had left behind. She had a brain that had spent 15 years figuring out how to explain complex systems to 12-year-olds, which meant she was exceptionally good at taking something enormous and incomprehensible and breaking it into steps that could actually be followed. She had 214 letters out. Within 48 hours of the first transport leaving her district, she had 309 responses. The meetings happened in basements, in church halls, in the back rooms of hardware stores that the CaHFY had deemed too economically marginal to bother monitoring. They happened in whispers and in silences between words, in a human language older than speech. The language of eyes that met across a room and held and said, "I see you," and said, "I am still here," and said, "We are not done." The KE had monitoring arrays across every major population center on Earth. What they did not have, because it had never been necessary in 11,000 years of administration, was a system to track informal human gatherings of fewer than 50 people that did not produce any digital communication signature whatsoever. They had not needed one. No species they had ever administered had organized this way. Most species under separation protocols stopped gathering voluntarily. The cognitive isolation response was well documented. Species drew inward. They grieved alone. Humans went to each other. By the end of the first week, Mara's network had connected 12 districts. By the end of the second week, it had crossed 3 state lines. By the end of the month, the same month in which the CaHFY completed the collection of approximately 680 million children from across the planet Earth, it had quietly, invisibly, without a single piece of traceable digital infrastructure, become the largest coordinated human network since the fall of the last governments. They called themselves nothing. Names were trackable. Names became databases. Names became targets. They called them. The CaHFY noticed something in week 3. Not the network that remained invisible to them, but an anomaly in behavioral compliance data. In species that had undergone integration preparation in the past, the removal of children produced a measurable decrease in collective action indicators within 14 days. Grief, the xenopsychologist explained, was paralyzing. It consumed energy that might otherwise go toward resistance. The human data was not following the curve. Collective action indicators were not decreasing, they were rising. Administrator General Vane Sar reviewed the data 3 times. He had administered 42 species integrations in his career. He was considered one of the finest administrative minds in the Dominion, the kind of bureaucrat who could look at a civilization's psychological profile and predict its behavior patterns with 94% accuracy. He stared at the human data for a long time. "Rerun the compliance calibration on the adult population," he said finally. "We may have had insufficient contact time." His deputy hesitated. "Sir, the calibration protocols were completed on schedule. All identified leadership structures were processed. The anomaly seems to be originating from non-leadership population segments." "Non-leadership," Vansar repeated. "Yes, sir. Agricultural workers, service industry employees, educators, medical personnel, individuals with no formal leadership designation in any of the pre-integration governmental structures." Vanes was quiet for a moment. "Find the center of it," he said. 3 days later, his intelligence team came back with a name. Mara Voss, former educator. No political affiliation, no criminal record, no prior contact with any monitored resistance network. No digital footprint whatsoever in connection with the anomaly. Only a pattern, only the ghost shape of 214 letters sent through physical post, a communications medium the Dominion had not thought to monitor because no species in 11,000 years had reverted to it. Vanes looked at the file on his screen for a long time. He thought about what his compliance officer had reported. A woman at a door saying something that had been flagged as behaviorally irregular but not threatening enough to escalate. Patience is not the same thing as acceptance. "Send a team," he said. "Administrative inquiry only. I want her cooperative, not escalated." He did not know that by the time his team reached her address, Marios had already been somewhere else for 6 hours. He did not know that she had known they were coming. He did not know that in a network of 309 parents, there was a woman who had been a software engineer for the city's infrastructure management department, and she had spent 3 weeks quietly mapping every monitoring array in a 40-kilometer radius. And she had given Mara a very precise list of safe routes. He did not know that grief, when it does not paralyze, becomes something else entirely. It becomes fuel. The CaHFY had a word for the period after integration preparation, in which the adult population of a new administrative subject was expected to normalize. They called it the settling phase. It lasted on average between 8 and 14 months, and it was named for the way a sediment settles to the bottom of water, not eliminated, just repositioned, made inert, made manageable. Earth's settling phase lasted 11 days. Then it stopped settling and started burning. Not with weapons. The humans had almost none that could touch CaHFY infrastructure. Not with riots. The compliance arrays were extremely effective at preventing mass gatherings above a certain threshold. It burned the way a fire burns when you can't find the source of it, when it seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. When every time you put it out in one place, it reappears in 3 others. It burned because humans, when they cannot fight the way the enemy expects, find a different way to fight. In the agricultural regions of what had been Central North America, farmers began mislabeling their output in the Dominion's food distribution system. Small errors, the kind that looked like data entry mistakes that redirected surplus nutrition to population centers, the KET had identified as compliance risks, and were quietly trying to resource constrain. The mislabeling network involved 412 farms across 6 former states. It operated entirely through physical handwritten manifests that were never digitized until after the redirection was complete. In the former European Medical Cooperative, a network of nurses and paramedics began documenting every behavioral anomaly produced by the compliance calibration process. They used paper. They used personal memory. They built an archive of what the CaHFY's calibration did to human neurology, an archive that was copied by hand into hundreds of identical physical documents and hidden in locations that a species without experience of pre-digital human infrastructure would never think to look. In the ruins of 3 former governments, low-level bureaucrats who had been deemed too administratively minor for compliance calibration began doing what bureaucrats do best. They created paperwork. Specifically, they created the paperwork for an entirely fictional administrative substructure within the Dominion's own integration framework. 12 layers of fictional departments, each with its own filing system and its own approval chains designed to slow Dominion administrative processing to a near standstill in every region where the network had a foothold. The CaHFY had governed 11,000 years of conquered species. They had never encountered an opponent who beat them with paperwork. But the center of it, the thing that Vansar's intelligence teams kept returning to, the thing that refused to be mapped or contained or administratively dissolved, was not the farmers or the nurses or the bureaucrats. It was the parents. Specifically, it was what parents knew about their children. The KE Integration Preparation Program operated on a fundamental assumption drawn from 11,000 years of multi-ACES behavioral data that the bond between parent and child, while strong, was a bond of presence. Remove the child, remove the presence, and the bond became a wound. Painful, incapacitating, self-consuming. A wound did not organize. A wound did not coordinate. A wound turned inward and destroyed itself. What the K had not modeled, what their 11,000 years of data had not contained, was what happened to that bond when the parents refused to let it become a wound. When Mara Voss sat in a warehouse on the edge of what used to be called Milwaukee and looked at the faces of 231 parents, she did not see grief. She had seen grief. She had felt it herself on the morning Ellie's face had disappeared around that corner, and it had been the most devastating thing she had ever experienced. But these people had done what she had done. They had taken the grief, and they had used it like a compass. They think they know what we are, she told them. Her voice carried in the warehouse, because she had spent 15 years making her voice carry in rooms full of distracted children. They've processed 42 species, and they have a file on all of them, and they think we're going to fit in that file. They took our kids, because that's what works. That's what always works. She paused. It's not going to work on us. How do you know? Someone asked. She couldn't see who. It didn't matter. Because I know what my daughter looks like when she's pretending to be asleep. Mara said, I know what she looks like when she's scared and trying not to show it. I know what she sounds like when she's lying and what she sounds like when she means something. I know every single thing about her that she hasn't figured out yet about herself. The warehouse was silent. That's what they took from us, she said. Not just our children, our knowing of them. And they think that without that we fall apart. She looked around the room. But here's the thing about knowing someone, that completely, it doesn't live in the knowing. It lives in the person who knows. And that person is still here. We're all still here. In the 3 weeks since the transports had left, Mara's network had done something that key intelligence analysts were only beginning to partially comprehend. They had reconstructed from memory a complete profile of every child who had been taken. Not a digital profile, not a database, a human one. Every parent in the network had written down everything they knew about their child. Every habit, every fear, every word they mispronounced, every song they sang to themselves, every way they laughed, every way they cried, everything they had said in the last week before they were taken. Those documents had been copied and cross-referenced and organized into something that, in a different context, might have been called an intelligence brief. It was called something else in the network. It was called We Remember. The purpose of We Remember was not sentimental, or rather, it was not only sentimental. When the CaHFY returned children at 16 with Dominion citizenship fully installed, they returned them changed. Not in visible ways, not in ways that a casual observer would notice, but in subtle ways, the flattening of certain personality expressions, the redirection of certain emotional responses, the replacement of culturally specific knowledge with Dominion standard frameworks. In every other species, parents received these altered children and after an initial period of confusion, accepted the changes. They were small, the child was still there, the love was still there. And the parents, having spent years in the settling phase, were different too. Soft, in the ways the Dominion needed them to be soft. The Ket did not know that we remember existed. They did not know that when their integration preparation program returned human children in 3 years, every single one of those children would come home to parents who knew them precisely well enough to know exactly what had been changed. They did not know that Maravos had a document copied now in hundreds of hands across 3 continents that described her daughter's left-handedness, her habit of humming while she ate, the specific way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, the fact that she could not say the word, particularly without substituting a P at the end, the nightmare she had twice a year in which something was lost and couldn't be found. They did not know that this document was also an instruction manual for how to bring a child back. Vanes received the second anomaly report on the 41st day of Earth's settling phase. The first anomaly had been behavioral, the failure of collective action indicators to decline. He had attributed this to incomplete calibration and had ordered supplemental compliance processing in 12 districts. The second anomaly was structural. His administrative processing pipeline for the Earth integration, a system that had successfully managed the bureaucratic absorption of 42 civilizations, had developed what his deputy described, with visible discomfort, as a recursive filing obstruction in regions encompassing approximately 63% of the planet's former governmental infrastructure. In simpler terms, the paperwork wasn't moving. Vanes spent 2 hours with his senior administrative team trying to diagnose the problem. The system was not malfunctioning. The data was not corrupt. What was happening, as best they could determine, was that every document submitted into the pipeline from those regions was generating a dependency chain, a requirement for prior approval from a sub-office that required prior approval from another sub-office, stretching back through a series of administrative structures that all appeared legitimate in the Dominion's own integration framework, but that when cross-referenced against the actual organizational chart of Earth's integration project did not exist. Someone had built ghost departments, someone who understood the Dominion's administrative architecture well enough to build load-bearing fictions inside it. Who designed our integration framework documentation? Vanes asked. The answer took 20 minutes to retrieve. The documentation architecture had been handled, as was standard practice for low-priority integrations, by a contracted administrative specialist from the Dominion's Bureau of New World Affairs. A specialist who, Vane's intelligence team would discover 3 days later, had been quietly providing framework documentation to a network of human bureaucrats who had used it as a template for the most precisely targeted administrative sabotage in 42 integrations. The specialist had not been coerced. The specialist had not been bribed. The specialist had a daughter. She had been aboard the ETH transport out of the European Administrative Zone. Her name was listed in the KET integration records as subject E7441. Her mother called her something else. The third anomaly arrived at the same time as the second. It came from the Dominion's integration preparation program itself, specifically from the behavioral monitoring system aboard the processing vessels where the human children were being held. The children were not settling. This was almost unprecedented. Children in integration preparation were by design the easier part. Remove them from their cultural context early. Introduce them to Dominion frameworks before their identities fully consolidated, and the integration was essentially complete within the first 6 months. Children adapted, children accepted, children became citizens. These children were not adapting. They were not rioting. They were not refusing instruction. They were by all surface metrics cooperative. They attended sessions. They completed assessments. They produced the correct behavioral outputs. But the monitoring systems designed to track the deeper indicators, the ones that measured whether a subject's core identity frameworks were actually shifting to Dominion-aligned structures, were returning the strangest data the program supervisors had ever seen. The children were performing adaptation, and underneath the performance, not one single thing had moved. It took the program supervisors another week to determine why. The children were singing, not out loud, not in ways the monitoring systems had been designed to detect, but in the quiet hours, in the spaces between mandatory activities, in the small persistences that children maintain almost without awareness. They were humming songs their parents had sung to them, and whispering words in languages the Dominion had flagged for replacement, and doing the small private things that were theirs, and not the Dominion's, and had never been the Dominion's, and would not be. A 7-year-old girl in processing block C9 ate her meals left-handed, even though the compliance program had spent 2 months attempting to retrain this as a cultural behavior marker. She could not have explained why. She only knew that it was hers. Her name in the CaHFY integration records was Subject E2891. Her mother called her Ellie. Vansar looked at the anomaly reports for a very long time. He thought about the behavioral compliance data. He thought about the ghost departments. He thought about children who performed integration while remaining somehow fundamentally themselves. He thought about a woman at a door in what used to be called Chicago, speaking in a voice so steady it had triggered a behavioral irregularity flag in a compliance officer who had processed 42 worlds and had never filed a flag like that before. He thought, "We have been here before. We have done this before. We know how this ends." And then, because he was a very intelligent being, and because he had also in his 11,000 years never encountered data that looked quite like this, he thought, "Do we?" He sent a message to the integration preparation vessels. Delay the behavioral normalization sequence. It was not a capitulation. It was not a concession. It was what it had always been for Vanes. A recognition of data. The data was saying something he did not yet have a framework for. He would need to develop one. In the warehouse on the edge of what used to be Milwaukee, Moraos received the intelligence 4 hours after he sent it. The woman who had mapped the monitoring arrays had also, it turned out, found a way into the edge of the K communication system. Not deep, not enough to be useful strategically, but enough to catch the ghost of a high-priority administrative signal and enough to know what it meant. Mara sat with it for a long time. Around her, the network was growing. Not just parents now, teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, farmers, the full cross-section of a species that was not fracturing, not settling, not becoming the sediment on the bottom of someone else's system. A species that was for the first time in its history completely unified in a single feeling. They were going to get their children back. Not in 3 years. Not as Dominion citizens with adjusted behavioral frameworks and flattened cultural expressions. Back the right way, fully, completely as themselves. And more than that, they were going to make the K understand something that 11,000 years of conquering had not taught them. Something that could not be found in any behavioral compliance database, or administrative framework, or integration protocol. Something that had no name in any of the 47 languages the Dominion used to govern its territories. There was a difference between a species that had not yet fought back and a species that was still deciding how. Earth had decided, not with weapons, not with riots, not with the blunt frontal force that the Dominion systems were perfectly designed to absorb and neutralize, with memory, with knowing, with the specific and irrefutable weight of 214 letters sent through physical post, of nurses writing by hand in basement, of farmers mislabeling crates, of bureaucrats building ghost departments, of children eating left-handed ed because it was theirs and it had always been theirs. With parents who had made a very simple calculation that there was no force in 11,000 years of empire, no administrative protocol, no compliance array, no integration preparation program, nothing that could account for what a parent would do when they knew with complete and total certainty exactly who their child was, and knew that that child was still there and was coming home. Maravos folded the intelligence report, placed it in her jacket pocket beside the letter she had written to Ellie the night the transports left. The letter she had not sent because there was nowhere to send it, because her daughter was somewhere in the dark above her in a gray ship with a number instead of a name. She would send it when Ellie was home. She would send it when Ellie could read it and say, "Yes, that's me. I'm still here." Outside the warehouse, through the high windows, the night sky was full of stars. Somewhere up there, 680 million children were sleeping in gray rooms with numbers on their doors. And somewhere down here, their parents were awake. Every single one of them waiting.